Now we're going to talk about what is AI. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what we call big AI ideas. And these are actually ideas that researchers came up with just to describe what AI is, because it's actually a big research question. We're not 100% unanimous. We don't all agree on what AI is. And so what researchers do is actually come up with ideas in order to define what these concepts are. And so I'm going to go through these one by one. The first one is perception, and it's all about how computers see, hear, and sense things and really make sense of what they're seeing and hearing. And so just a couple of examples. To sense the world, you could have a camera or different sensors like an ultrasonic sensor, which is the one that often Roombas or robotic vacuums will have. You can also have like laser distance sensors, or even microphones. Those are all sensors. It's basically gathering data, gathering information about the world, and then trying to make sense of it. So that's the first one, perception. The second one is representation and reasoning. And so this is basically computers, they can gather all of this data and collect it, and then they also want to represent it in a certain way, maintain that information, and make decisions on it. And so, for example, you might have a self-driving car, an autonomous vehicle, and it might be trying to make a right turn, but it doesn't quite know if it should do that or not. And so what it does is actually gather distance data, visual data, but what's around it, for instance, like these cyclists on the side of the road, and then it'll basically take all of that data, collect it, put it into a specific organization. So that might be a graph, like you see in the middle, or a tree type graph on the right side. And then it can actually make decisions. And so by taking all of this information and putting it into a specific organization, that can really help these systems make sense of the world. And so that's representation and reasoning. So now we've gone through perception, which is seeing the world or hearing it or sensing it. Representation and reasoning, which is really collecting that data, putting it into a specific data structure, which is what we call basically just organizing data. Computer scientists often use that word data structure. And then the third one is learning, which is where I think it gets really exciting, because machines can actually learn new things and pick up specific patterns about the world. And that's where a lot of the research is today. So you might have noticed on different social media feeds, or just like images like on Google Photos, sometimes these systems can actually guess what's within the image. So it might be guessing like, oh, this is an object, this is, a water bottle, a laptop, or it might actually be guessing a specific face. And so, for instance, a computer might take in a bunch of data and have a bunch of photos of Vic, for instance, and a bunch of photos of Tommy, for instance, and then try and decide whether a new picture of Tommy or Vic is either Tommy or is Vic. So that's one example of learning new things. Another example is different social media feeds. So for instance, Instagram or YouTube or Netflix, they all have algorithms that actually choose different things to suggest to you based on your data that you've given them. So for instance, you might have liked a certain photo or entered, posted something, and based on that, it's going to decide what you see next on the app. So that's an example of learning from your data or learning from data in the world. And so now we've gone through perception, which is sensing or viewing the world, representation and reasoning, which is taking that data, collecting it, put it in a specific structure. We went through learning, which is really just coming up with new patterns or seeing new things and recognizing what that is, or classifying things. And then now we're going to go through natural interaction, which is really just enabling machines to communicate in a natural way with humans, because they don't naturally do that. And so this is a really quick video of a self-driving car. Basically, this is, vision algorithm. and it's seeing people, it's recognizing that there's people there, recognizing that the person might be able to see the car or is walking really quickly or slowly, and then determining how to react to that specific human. So maybe it's going to stop for that person, or maybe it's going to inch forward to kind of let the person know that it wants to continue on the road. And so that's something we as programmers actually have to decide and enable these machines to do, is to interact naturally with humans. So now we've gone through perception, which is sensing the world, representation and reasoning, which is taking that data, putting it into a specific structure, learning, which is coming up with new patterns and learning new things, and then natural interaction, which is how machines can actually interact with humans in a natural way. And the fifth one, which I think is the most important one, is societal impact. So how does AI actually affect our daily lives and society at large? Because that's really, really important as more and more of these machines come into our daily lives, and we see them every day. And so, for instance, like I mentioned before, YouTube is an example of AI. It has a system that will suggest certain things to you. And what does it mean if it's suggesting a certain video to everyone? Or how does that affect our lives, depending on what it's suggesting, right? And another example is having these assistant devices in our world, and how that affects our lives, right? If we're talking to it, it's giving us a specific answer about something, and maybe it's giving the right answer, maybe it's giving the wrong answer, and what does that mean for humans as a whole, right? And then I thought this was a really interesting article. It's all about how machines can actually grade student essays. And so this is actually happening today. And basically, the system will take in a bunch of essays, see how humans graded those essays, find patterns in that data, and then start grading in a similar way to how the humans graded the essays too. But it's interesting to think about what kind of patterns it might be picking up on, right? It might be picking up on a particular style that someone is writing in, or maybe there's a lot of typos and one person graded essays with a lot of typos very poorly. And one of the questions that we should ask as like AI researchers and people who are writing this code is it actually okay that we're using these systems to grade essays? Because there might actually be biases in how it grades, and it might grade a certain group of people's essay like really well versus another group of people's essays not as well. And is that fair, right? And so we're going to be having a discussion about this in a little bit with Tommy, but I just wanted to mention it right now to give you an idea of what societal impact means. So now we're going to play a little bit of a game or an activity, and we're going to try to guess if a certain object is AI or if it's not AI, and also if it's conversational AI or not conversational AI. And so I have like a little example here. So we might be looking at a toaster, and then some reasons it might be AI is that it makes food like humans. It has a sense of time kind of like humans. And then reasons for why it might not be AI is that it doesn't actually understand when toast is done, and it needs a human to turn it on. So those are just some examples. And now I'm going to go through some questions we can ask as we're thinking about specific objects. So the first question or thought experiment here is, does the example perceive or understand its environment? And there's a difference between really perceiving and understanding something and just sensing it. So for instance, a camera senses an image and senses different light and reflections that's coming into the camera itself, right? And then it creates pixels, but it's not really understanding what those pixels mean. It's not understanding that maybe, this is an image of a laptop, or this is an image of a human. And so a camera would be, generally speaking, is not AI, because it's not really understanding what it's seeing. Another question you can ask is, does the example continue to learn? And again, there's kind of a difference between learning and just having a knowledge bank. And so there are computer programs that can play solved games like tic-tac-toe, and they can actually just follow rules. And based on these rules, the system can always win, or at least tie the person in tic-tac-toe. And so that example is more just like following a plan. It's not actually learning something. But if, for instance, it was playing like a video game and it was watching this person play this video game over and over and over and over, and then learning patterns on how that person actually wins the video game, then that would be an example of AI. But if it has like a prior knowledge bank that it's using to win, then it's generally not a case of AI. Third question is, does the example make plans or decisions on its own? And again, just kind of along the similar lines as what I said with learning, there's a difference between planning and so making a plan and just following a plan. And so there's these robotic vacuums, right? And the first robotic vacuums, as they went along the floor, they would just go in a straight line, bump into something, turn around, go in a straight line, bump into something, and go around. And that's actually just following rules that a human has made, rather than creating a plan and like thinking about the rooms and thinking about where it should actually vacuum. So the fourth question is, does the example actually interact within its environment? And so again, difference between interacting with the environment and really just following a script. So for instance, you could have a chatbot that, let's say you're talking to it over the phone, and every time there's a new question, it's asking you a question, you have to actually enter in like a number. And so it says like, enter 1 if you live in Boston, or enter 2 if you live in somewhere else, right? And that's not actually interacting with the environment. It's more just following rules again, and pre-programmed things in order to communicate with someone. But if it was learning and really recognizing the intent of what someone was saying, and could generalize over phrases and understand what the person was saying, then that would be considered interacting with the environment. And then the last question is kind of like a catch-all. So it's really about who's doing the thinking and when it was done. So for instance, you might have a system that was pre-programmed to follow some rules. And in that case, the human is really doing the thinking, right? The human programmed in the rules. But you might have a different system that's actually coming up with the rules itself and finding patterns, and that's generally considered AI. And so it's really interesting to think about these questions because, like I said at the start of the presentation, we're still coming up with the definition of AI, and that's constantly changing. Because like back in the day, we didn't have as advanced systems. And so things like rules-based AI, which is definitely was considered AI, just like actually the app we created yesterday that had the conversational agent where you programmed it to say something in response to hello. We created a rule, right? And you can call that rule-based AI. But generally speaking now, that's not actually considered AI. Because it's not really doing any learning there. And so we'll go over a couple examples, and hopefully things will become more clear as we go through them. And before I get into the examples, really quickly, something to think about too is this conversational AI? So if it's conversational AI, it both has to understand what you're saying to it, and then also be able to respond to you in natural language. So basically, if it's able to have a conversation with you and it's learning and it's also AI, then that would be considered conversational AI. All right, so let's go through the first example. And I'd love for people to just kind of call out or tell me what they think. And this particular example is an automatic door. So if someone walks close to it, it's going to open. And if there's no one around, it's going to close. So can someone give me some ideas for whether this might be AI or whether it might not be AI, and why? Yep. So there's different ways these doors work. I think you can see on this one that there's actually a sensor above and it's sensing distance. And I would agree that this is like a rules-based thing. And although it does have a sensor, like you said, it's just following a rule whether someone is there or not. So so how it has like a sensor kind of, it makes you think like, you know, maybe it's perceiving the world. But if we go back to that question about perception, whether it's really perceiving and understanding what it's sensing, or if it's just, you know, sensing like a signal that's either there or not there, then it might be, if it's just like sensing if it's there or not there, I would say that's not AI. If it was perceiving like what's actually in the image it's seeing. So if it's actually seeing like a human, or recognizing, you know, maybe this is a dog and it doesn't open the door for a dog, but it does open the door for a human, then that might be AI. So I'm going to do a really, really quick poll. And this is totally like personal opinion. So if you think it's AI, you can select it is AI. If you don't think so, you can select that. And then it's also asking, is this conversational AI? And again, the questions for conversational AI are, can it understand human language and can it respond in human language? So I'm going to launch that poll. If you could answer, that would be great. Okay, awesome. So it looks like most people think it's not AI. And some people aren't really sure. Some people think it is AI. So again, I think it really depends on whether it's recognizing things, recognizing specific objects and learning patterns, or if it's just a sensor that sees someone, opens the door, and follows that rule. And the thinking is actually done by the programmer initially. And so in most cases, the thinking is done by the programmer. It's really a rule whether there's an object close by or not, whether it'll open the door or not. And so I would say this is not AI. And since it's not talking to us or communicating in natural language, I'd say it's not conversational AI too. All right, so let me just see here. I'm gonna end the poll and then we'll go to the next one. So this is a drone and you can see that someone's controlling it. Could we have some people just let us know whether they think this drone might be AI or might not be AI and why? All right, so I think those are really good ideas. I am gonna do the poll again and then I'll talk about what I think. So it looks like most people don't think it's AI. Some people think it is, which I think is pretty valid actually. And then most people also don't think it's conversational AI. And so what my thoughts when I think about whether this is AI or not is, yeah, where's the thinking happening? I think someone mentioned this. And I would say that the thinking is happening with the person who's actually controlling the drone. But if this drone could actually recognize objects, or if it could actually sense like when it's close to something and decide to move in a specific direction and react to that, to how close it is to something, and if it's actually figuring out how to whether something is close, then I would say it's AI. But since it's being controlled by someone, I would say this is not AI. So this one is all about automatic captioning. So I don't know if you've seen this, maybe on YouTube recently. Yeah, so if you might have seen automatic captioning before, basically it's taking in sound audio input and then outputting what the person said on the screen. And so how about some people just share some ideas about whether they think this is AI or not AI and why? Yeah, anyone else thinking about conversational AI and whether or not this would be conversational AI? Cool, yeah, so there's some differing opinions on conversational AI, and I'll do the poll, and I'd love to see what everyone else thinks too. So it looks like most people thinks this is AI, but it's a little more split. There's some people who think it's not AI, and some people who aren't quite sure. I would say that this is AI because, again, it's taking in a lot of data, looking at all of that data, trying to find patterns in the words that people are saying, and really understanding what those audio signals mean. So for instance, if it was just recording what the people were saying and then just playing back that audio recording, I'd say that's not AI because it's not actually understanding what's going on. But since it's really understanding what's going on and converting it into a different really mode or like output mode into text, I would say this is AI. And then in terms of conversational AI, this is a tricky one because basically it is understanding what you're saying, but it's not actually like responding to what you're saying. It is like outputting what you're saying, and it almost seems like a response, but since it's not saying something different and like interacting in a conversational way with someone, I would say it's not conversational AI, but that it is AI. So that's my opinion. And then let's go to the next slide and do the next one. So this is a chatbot. It's actually a medical chatbot, let's say. And so you go into a doctor's office and you can talk to it and it'll respond to questions you have. And then also it's going to try and come up with a diagnosis of what you might have based on your symptoms that you've told it. And so I'd like you guys, like, this isn't super obvious because I haven't told you everything about the chatbot. So you can ask me questions about how the chatbot works. And then based on my answers or what you think, if you could give me some opinions on whether this is AI or not, that would be great. Okay, so it looks like most people think it is AI. Some people don't think it's AI. And it is kind of tough because I haven't told you everything about the system. But again, because it seems to be understanding what I'm saying, and it's able to understand multiple different things, and it's not just, you're not just choosing a specific answer and then it following a rule to answer it. I would say this is AI. Is it conversational AI? Again, I didn't really specify whether it was responding in natural language, but I think most people probably assumed it was. And so since it's able to understand what I'm typing to it, and then it's able to come up with a text-based response, then I would say it's also conversational AI.